just being here to ask these questions and to try to get some answers is just exciting to me to see you being willing to do that. Because we don't see much of that in Washington today. We have gotten away from any kind of strategic thinking. Our planning, when I first came here, I would bemoan the fact that we did 6-month planning, and now I get excited when we do 6-month planning because it seems like we're doing off-the-cuff planning as we go. But I just want to start off with just an amazing statement that we heard just a few hours ago at our Armed Services hearing, and I don't know if any of you had the opportunity to watch that or hear that, but for the first time in 2 years, we had all of the chiefs that were in there, and I asked them this question. I said, based on where you've come with the cuts that you've had now, and with sequestration, if it continues, can you meet the strategic guidance of 2012? Can you meet the bare requirements of this very, very minimal guidance that we have? And every single one of the chiefs said no. In fact, the Army and the Marine Corps actually said that we possibly could win a single conflict, much less have a win in one conflict and hold it. And you would think that would be kind of startling. In fact, I told some members on the floor when I went over there later, you would think our leadership on both sides of the aisle, based on that, would be saying we're going to have 24-hour meetings until we can fix that problem and get a fix for it. But I think Washington has become an area where if Paul Revere were to ride through our streets today and somebody said, who's that? The other person would just simply say, at least some nut on a horse that's trying to stir people up with the warmest thoughts. And I would just suggest to you, it's kind of when we come to national defense, it's time for us to stir some people up and maybe get some warmest thoughts. And one of the things that I think is important that we do is in looking at our industrial base. And I want to kind of flag you back just a few years ago and kind of bring you forward on the picture that we had. We very popularly talked about sequestration. I mean, that's now become a buzzword. And I remember when it was first proposed, nobody knew what the term was. Everybody was running for thesauruses and dictionaries to look. And now all of you kind of have that. In fact, most of your speakers here will want every problem we have on national defense, on sequestration. But before sequestration, take sequestration off the table. Remember, we had $778 billion of cuts to national defense. Now, the figure you will hear is $487 billion. And then there was $100 billion before that. But if you look at our chart from the Armed Services Committee, you'll see it's really $778 billion of cuts that took place. And I want you to look at this pattern because it was kind of gradual as it hit until you look at where we ended up. We took our land-based missile defense systems out of Europe because Russians just asked us to do it, so we're going to do what they asked us to do, and we put them on the back of the Navy, but gave them no additional assets at all to be able to do that. We cut our F-22s down from 250 to 187 without a single study to back that up. We now want to do away with 7 of our cruisers, and one of those cruisers we should, but 6 of those cruisers together have twice the combined surface missile capability of the British Navy. And we want to not mothball them, but to do away with them. Today, the CNO told us that they only had 1 carrier group, strike group, that was forward deployed, and 1 that could have surge capacity, as opposed to normally having 3. And as you know, the Secretary's talked about moving away with 3 carrier strike groups, not carriers. In addition to that, we have had cuts in our personnel that we have seen across the globe. And the impact of all of that is if we don't just sit back in an armchair and pontificate on what we think we need, but we do it a little more objective by taking our combatant commanders, which all of you know is the cream of the crop of what we have, and we say, what are your validated requirements, and how many of those can we meet? We see that in 2007, we met 90% of our combatant commanders' requirement. This year and last year, we will meet 50% of those requirements. And if sequestration stays where it is, we will probably move down below 30%. You see what's happening with the number of ships that we're actually building. And unfortunately, if you walk these halls, the concept that most people have is that defense is somehow like a faucet, that we can turn it on and we can turn it back off, and then we can turn it on again. And of course, you know from the discussions you've had with the industrial base, you just can't do that. It just doesn't work that way. And one of the things that is very, very concerning to me is if I look at our statistics, and I just take our carriers, for example. The last carrier we built, 40% of all our vendors were sole source vendors. This carrier, 60% will be sole source vendors. But the next carrier that we built will be 80% sole source vendors. And that is startling when you look around at our nation and you recognize that on many of our platforms now, we are actually starting to worry, not just will we have somebody else that can provide what we need to build that platform, but what about servicing that platform down the road, 5 years, 10 years down the road? Are they going to be? I had a contractor tell me the other day, and I haven't been able to validate this yet, but I have no reason to disbelieve what he said, that we had a shaft problem on one of our ships, and they were looking around at somebody who could fix it. And we had no domestic vendors that could fix it. So they had to bring someone in from Britain, and it took them 14 days through customs before they could get it through and get it back to fix that particular problem that was there. And that is a major concern to us. If you look at, for example, York Air Conditioners, which is always been stable with our ships, we now are getting in line behind the Chinese because they are buying so many of them. And we have to wait until their contracts are fulfilled before we get ours. And we're paying more for ours because they're buying in bulk. And at some particular point in time, we have to sit back and say as a nation, we're going to step back and start looking strategically once again at where we are. We can't run down every red herring that runs in every situation in the world. But we've got to look back strategically and say, what does this military need to look like? What does it need to look like down the road? And the second important part of that is, how are we going to build it, and how are we going to sustain it? And I would suggest that we can kind of put that on the table if we haven't been focused on it. And that's why I'm so excited to see what you are doing here and looking at that. And the final thing that I just want to raise to you, and I'd love to respond to your questions that you have. It's not just the core capabilities that we have. And I really appreciate your paper. I read it, and I read the 6 that you came up with, and I think that's important for us to do. But we also have to remember to provide some way for the innovative kinds of concepts that we don't even know about today that may be presenting themselves tomorrow. And let me just give you a perfect example. When I was in law school, I was a little nerdy, and I would not only read the stuff that I have, but sometimes on break, I'd walk through the shelves and read old government studies. And I remember reading one that had taken place in the early 1900s, and it was an interesting study. It had been commissioned by Congress that had done this huge study, and it came back and it talked about this enormous problem that we were going to have in the 60s because we would have so much horse manure because of all the population explosion we would have and all the horses that would be necessary to do transportation. We were going to have this huge, huge problem. And of course, no one even thought about the car being invented and changing all that. And then, of course, all the problems that would come in from there. Well, we're looking at the kind of innovation that we may be looking at and seeing tomorrow. And it may be things that we're not even thinking about today. What we're doing with our seminar, what we're doing, for example, something as simple as testing, which could save us millions of dollars. Those kind of capabilities, we have got to find ways of protecting. And I think part of that is going to be how do we create the kind of innovative environment for these companies to come along and not only create these capabilities, but then make sure that they have some skin in the game down the road and get protected so we don't drop them from them and take them away, because if we do, we'll lose that kind of capability that's there. So I want to thank you guys for what you're doing. Thank you for asking these tough questions. And I'd be happy to respond to any of your questions, don't you have about anything specifically, or anything you think as a committee we should be doing to make sure we're focused on this in a proper way. Yes, ma'am.
Sir, Sandy Swartzbach from the Neighborhood Workers Center at China Lake.
Hi, Sandy.
Thank you so much for all that you do for defense. We appreciate it very much. My question concerns the ability to communicate the value of the military we struggle with that in the Navy as effectively making sure why do the American people care about what they pay for the military? I've heard this from General Madison. He's talking about, give us your sons and daughters and bucketloads of money and just trust us to spend it wisely. And this is what we're trying to struggle with. How do you get across? Why do you want us to spend a bunch of money?
Great question, Sandy. And let me tell you, first of all, what we're trying to do. We are trying to create something that we haven't had before in Congress, which are defense dialogues. They're below the radar screen. It's no staff in there. It's no press in there. And it's between members, uniformed individuals, some writers, some thinkers, to begin to look logistically outside of the Armed Services Committee. So we're first educating policymakers on why we need to spend the money. Second thing, though, is we're trying to bring industry leaders together with people at the Pentagon to try to say the language you have used is the wrong language. I mean, when you walk in and talk about reset, I will tell you, you have reset every person in that room, and nobody's paying attention to you. If you talk about something like modeling and simulation, and you bring somebody in, they have to explain how they do it, and nobody cares. You know, in 11 seconds, you've lost them. And you are absolutely right. When you walk in a crowd today, and you begin to talk to the average person, all they see is Afghanistan and Iraq, and they're turning you off within about 11 seconds. My thought is that we have to come up with 4 or 5 basic messaging pictures that we're able to give to the public to show them why. Now, if I could just take a little bit of my time, I think we've got some great lessons in history for us. I mean, I'm from Virginia. Our whole existence came about by luck, really, because we looked out and the French fleet was sitting out in the Chesapeake Bay. Had they arrived 5 days earlier, the British scouting party would have seen them, and it would have been a whole different country than what we have today. If the British ships had been prepared and had been repaired the way they needed to be, it would have probably been a whole different world. If you then fast forward to Trafalgar and you look at that great battle that you had and what the British learned from there were 4 great lessons that they learned. I mean, they learned the importance of industrial base. They learned the importance of training because they could fire 3 to 2 times the French and Spanish. But they also realized what Nelson realized, how important it was. The biggest threat to Great Britain was not that Napoleon would come across the channel, but it was going to be that they would lose this international commercial system that funded everything that happened in Great Britain. For 100 years, they dominated the seas. Then we came behind them, but there's nobody behind us. So here's the pictures I think we need to paint. I think people do understand when you walk into a crowd, Republicans, Democrats, Independents, people who are not interested in military, when you just tell them, look, we met 90% of the needs of our combatant commanders in 2007. Today, we're meeting 50% of the needs. Is that the military you want? Number 2, when you tell them the Chinese are going to have 78 submarines in 8 years in the Pacific, and we're going to have 32, is that the world you want? When you tell them if we have a 5th generation airplane and it needs a 4th generation airplane, the 4th generation airplane dies. It's just that reality. And yet we're seeing the Chinese and the Russians developing every day those 5th generation planes, and we don't want to be behind that curve and lose that superiority. And then when you tell them 80% to 90% of the commerce you're dealing with is coming over the waterways, Admiral Locklear, I think, had a great statement. The ranking member asked him, why are we spending so much on our Navy when you have all these other navies that aren't spending as much? And he said, I thought very appropriately, he said, if you want me to defend Norfolk and San Diego, I'm good to go. He said, but you're asking me to defend all the oceans of the world. And I think when we start painting pictures like that to people, and then the final one I would tell you is because of what we're doing on our maintenance situations, what I tell anybody is if you had your son or daughter and you were putting them on an airplane and posted at the door was a sticker that said, I want to give you this disclaimer, that we've only done 70% of the maintenance on this plane and that our pilots have only had 70% of the training that they need, what would you do with your son and daughter? And you yank him off of there, and yet that's what they're asking me to do with your sons and daughters on our ships, around. There's a picture, Sandy. We don't have all the answers, but I think that's the world we have to paint for the American people. And look, the other encouraging thing is this. I'm often asked, do you see the future, especially in national defense, positively or negatively? And it depends on where we look. If you look historically, we're Americans. We've always done everything. We've met the challenges that we've had. If you look prospectively, the curve lines look hard. But we've done it before. Carl Vinson did it with the Navy. We can do it again. We just have to have the courage to stand up and make those pictures for the American. Anybody else? Yes, sir.
Thank you, Congressman Donovan.